Gerald Marsh was standing at his kitchen window with a coffee mug when the excavator took its first bite out of his backyard. Nobody had warned him. No letter, no permit notice taped to his door, not even a courtesy knock the evening before. The machine had simply arrived, the way things arrive when someone has decided you don't need to be consulted, and now it was sitting 12 feet inside his property line on a Tuesday morning, pulling the earth open like it was nothing. He set down the mug and walked outside. A crew in hard hats waved him back. HOA business, they said. Authorized project. Step back, sir. Gerald had lived on Sycamore Ridge Drive for 22 years. He'd paid his HOA dues every single month for 22 years. And he had never once been told that anyone had the right to dig up his backyard without asking him first. He didn't step back. "Show me the authorization," he said. The foreman pulled out a document, 2 pages, Gerald's address at the top, and at the bottom, on the signature line, his name, Gerald Allen Marsh. Except Gerald had never seen that document before in his life, and he had never, not once in 67 years, signed his name with just an initial. Someone had signed it for him. Gerald Marsh was 67 years old, a retired civil engineer, and the kind of man who kept every document he had ever signed in a fireproof filing cabinet in his basement, organized by year. 31 years with the Ohio Department of Transportation, the kind of career built on survey maps and property records, and the understanding that precision was not optional, it was the job. He took early retirement in 2001, moved to Sycamore Ridge with his wife Carol the following spring, and spent that first summer building raised garden beds along the rear fence line. The garden was Carol's idea. She had a green spiral notebook where she sketched the layout in pencil and wrote notes in the margins. Gerald will say it's too much work. He'll be wrong. Carol died in 2019. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months. After that, the garden became Gerald's. Not because he loved gardening, but because she had, and tending it was a way of keeping something alive. He paid his HOA dues on the first of every month. He'd attended 3 meetings in 22 years. He believed in minding his own business. The current HOA president, Diane Holbrook, had been counting on exactly that. 18 months into her presidency, Diane had pushed through a $740,000 drainage and infrastructure project, special assessment, all 214 homeowners. Gerald paid his share without complaint, without reading the fine print, without asking a single question. That was the opening she needed. The foreman's name was Ray. Company jacket, clipboard, the unhurried expression of a man who had dealt with upset homeowners before and expected this to be over in 5 minutes. Gerald said, "Show me the authorization." Ray pulled out a folded document and handed it over. 2 pages. A utility and drainage easement agreement. Gerald's address at the top. The Sycamore Ridge HOA as grantee. The rear 12 feet of his property as the drainage corridor. Effective date, 14 months ago. At the bottom, on the signature line above the words, property owner, Gerald A. Marsh. He handed it back without a word, went inside and opened the filing cabinet. 4 drawers, organized by year. Every HOA document he had ever received going back to 2002. He pulled everything from the past 3 years and spread it on the kitchen table. No easement request, no notice, no letter, nothing. He called the HOA office. Voicemail. Called again at 2. This time Patricia, the administrative coordinator, picked up. Gerald gave her 4 sentences. Contractors on his property, signed easement bearing his name. He hadn't signed it. He wanted the work stopped. Patricia put him on hold. Came back with the voice of someone reading from a prepared position. The project was board approved last August. Homeowners were notified by certified mail. Non-response was treated as consent. Gerald said he never received a letter. Patricia said she'd pass that along. 22 minutes later, Diane Holbrook called. The HOA president had a particular kind of voice, warm, unhurried, carrying the suggestion that whatever you were upset about was a small misunderstanding she was graciously helping you past. Gerald had heard it before. It was the voice people used when the decision had already been made, and the conversation was just a formality. Diane told him the easement was properly executed. The signature was valid, and stopping the project now would expose all 214 homeowners to breach of contract penalties. Gerald asked where the notification letter had been sent. She gave him an address he hadn't lived at in 3 years. He said, "That's not my address. I never got the letter." Diane said she understood his frustration and suggested he bring his concerns to the next monthly board meeting, 6 weeks away, with an excavator still running in his backyard. Gerald ended the call and sat at the kitchen table. He was a civil engineer, 31 years of reading documents. He knew what a man's signature looked like after a lifetime of signing, the rhythm of it, the habits, the things that never changed. The signature on Ray's document said, Gerald A. Marsh. Gerald Allen Marsh had never used an initial. Not on his marriage certificate, not on his mortgage, not on a single engineering document in 31 years with the state of Ohio. He pulled his original deed. Gerald Allen Marsh. His 2002 HOA agreement. Gerald Allen Marsh. Carol's garden notebook, inside front cover, her handwriting. Property of Carol and Gerald Allen Marsh. He set the notebook down. Then he called his son Kevin. Kevin drove up from Cincinnati Saturday morning, 2 coffees in hand, with the focused expression of a man who had spent the drive thinking through a problem. He was 41, a contracts manager for a construction firm, which meant his job was reading agreements other people had written and finding the places where the language didn't match the intent. He sat at Gerald's kitchen table and went through everything. The easement photograph, the address discrepancy, Diane's call, the filing cabinet going back to 2002. He looked at the signature for a long time. Gerald A. Marsh, he said. Gerald said, "I've never signed my name that way. Not once." Kevin pulled up the county recorder's website on his laptop. Gerald's original deed, public record. Gerald Allen Marsh. He looked at the notary stamp on the easement photograph. Patricia M. Wallen. A commission number. A date 14 months prior. "You ever use a notary named Wallen?" Gerald said he had not. Kevin called a college friend who now practiced real estate law in Columbus. Douglas Ferrara agreed to a Monday consultation. That weekend, Gerald started calling neighbors. He didn't use words like fraud or forgery. He simply said he was looking into the easement process and wanted to know what their experience had been. He worked through 11 homeowners along the rear corridor over Saturday and Sunday. 3 had signed without reading. 1 thought it was the same survey consent form from years back. Walt Pruitt, a retired English teacher 3 houses east, had actually called the HOA with questions. Patricia told him that homeowners who refused to cooperate could face a court-ordered easement and would be responsible for all legal costs. Walt had signed. Gerald asked, "Did the signature on the document look like yours?" Walt paused. He hadn't looked carefully. He didn't keep a copy. 3 other neighbors said they never received a notice at all. In 2 of those cases, the HOA's address on file was outdated, a prior address, a closed P.O. box. The same problem as Gerald's. Not one discrepancy, a pattern. Monday morning, Douglas Ferrara listened for 20 minutes without interrupting. Then he said, "What you're describing could constitute document fraud. The signature alone is worth a formal challenge. But the notarization question is potentially more serious. Ohio law requires the signatory to be physically present when the notary stamp is applied. If that didn't happen, it's not just a paperwork error, it's a notarial crime." He told Gerald to do 3 things immediately. File a written objection with the HOA by certified mail, demanding the work stop. Request all easement documents and board minutes under the community's disclosure provisions, and put a stop work demand on file before another day of excavation happened on his property. Ferrara drafted all 3 letters that afternoon. Gerald mailed them Tuesday morning, certified, return receipt. Then drove to the HOA office on Route 16 and hand-delivered copies. Patricia took the envelope at the front desk without expression. That evening, Diane Holbrook emailed back. 4 paragraphs. Attorney reviewed, clearly. It cited Ohio Revised Code. It referenced the board's fiduciary duty. And it positioned Gerald's objection not as a dispute with the HOA, but as an act against his neighbors, because stopping the project would trigger breach of contract penalties passed down to all 214 households. The last paragraph said it plainly. The board is confident in the document's authenticity. Any legal action you initiate will be pursued at your sole expense. Gerald read that line 3 times. He knew exactly what it was, a financial threat dressed in legal language. Diane was betting a 67-year-old man on a fixed income would see the words sole expense and decide the garden wasn't worth it. He called Marcus. His younger son was 38, a project analyst in Cleveland. He had Gerald's eye for documents and Carol's instinct for the question nobody else thought to ask. The question Marcus asked was, "Dad, what does your actual survey say about the rear property line?" Gerald pulled it from the cabinet. A licensed professional survey, recorded with Franklin County, done 8 years ago when he extended the cedar planters. He looked at the survey, then at the easement photograph on his phone. The HOA was treating the rear fence as the property boundary. The survey said the actual line ran 4 feet beyond the fence. The previous owners had placed the fence inside the real boundary, common enough in older planned communities, easy to miss if nobody checks. The excavator wasn't working 12 feet inside Gerald's property. It was working 16. Gerald photographed the survey, marked the discrepancy in pencil, and sent it to Ferrara. Ferrara called back in 40 minutes. "Get out there tomorrow morning before the crew arrives. Tape measure, phone, timestamps. I want every measurement documented." Gerald was in the backyard at 6:15 with a flashlight. Fence to trench edge, 11 feet. Actual property line to far edge, 15 feet. Every inch of it his property. Not 1 foot of common area touched. Every inch unauthorized. Thursday arrived with an envelope. Not mailed, placed on Gerald's doorstep sometime before 7 in the morning, in a manila envelope with the Sycamore Ridge HOA logo in the upper left corner. Gerald found it when he went out to get the newspaper. Inside were 3 separate citation notices, each formatted on official HOA letterhead. The first cited Gerald for unauthorized modification of landscaping in a common area adjacent zone. The second cited him for interference with HOA authorized contractor operations. The third cited him for failure to maintain his rear fence in conformance with community aesthetic standards, specifically Section 4.7b of the Sycamore Ridge Architectural Guidelines, which required all wooden fencing visible from common areas to be free of visible warping, discoloration, or structural misalignment. Attached to the third citation was a photograph of Gerald's rear fence line. In the photograph, taken based on the angle, from somewhere in the common area, one picket near the northeast corner post appeared to lean approximately 3 degrees off vertical. The recommended fine, $150 per day until the fence was brought into full compliance. Carol's roses grew along that fence. Gerald photographed all 3 notices and texted them to Ferrara before he'd finished his coffee. Ferrara's response came back in 11 minutes. "This is retaliatory citation. Classic HOA intimidation pattern. Do not pay anything. Contest all 3 citations in writing within the required response window. I'll draft them today. Document everything. Date, time, exact wording." Gerald spent Friday morning doing 2 things. He mailed Ferrara's 3 contest letters, certified, return receipt. And he walked the rear fence line one more time with his tape measure, this time making sure to get his survey stake in the frame of every photograph, a steel pin in the ground at the northeast corner of his property, placed by a licensed surveyor 8 years ago, establishing beyond any administrative dispute exactly where his land ended and the common area began. Then he typed a message on the Sycamore Ridge Community Facebook group. He did not accuse anyone of anything. He did not use the words fraud or forgery or retaliation. He was a civil engineer. He knew the difference between a claim and evidence, and he was not going to make claims he couldn't yet support in writing. He wrote, "I wanted to make other homeowners aware that excavation work associated with the drainage project appears to be occurring inside private property lines along the rear corridor, not in the common area. If you live along this corridor and signed an easement document related to this project, I would encourage you to pull out your copy and compare the described easement area against your actual survey records. Specifically check whether the document uses your fence line or your recorded property line as the reference boundary. Happy to discuss offline." He posted it at 11:15 Friday morning. By Saturday morning, the post had 63 comments. Most were questions. A few were from neighbors who said they had no idea where their easement documents were. Several were from people saying they hadn't signed anything and hadn't known there was an easement requirement. One was from a man 2 streets over who said he had tried to raise questions about the project at the August board meeting and been told the agenda item was closed. Diane Holbrook's response appeared Sunday afternoon. It was 2 paragraphs. The first stated that the drainage improvement project had been properly approved through all required HOA governance processes and that all easement agreements had been obtained lawfully. The second noted that social media posts containing inaccurate or inflammatory information created community anxiety and undermined the HOA's efforts to improve shared infrastructure, and invited residents to direct questions through official channels. 3 separate commenters replied asking Diane to post copies of the easement agreements for community review. Diane did not respond to those comments. Monday morning, Gerald's phone rang at 8:45. The caller was a woman named Sandra Voigt. She lived at number 31, 4 houses west, directly on the rear easement corridor. Sandra was 62. She had lived in Sycamore Ridge for 11 years. She told Gerald she had been following his Facebook post and the comments, and that she had something she needed to tell him, but that she had been nervous to say it publicly. Gerald told her he was listening. Sandra said she had received the easement notice last September. She had called the HOA office with questions. Patricia, the coordinator, had been patient and friendly and had explained that the easement was part of a community improvement project that would benefit everyone on the corridor. Sandra had asked if she could have a lawyer look at the document first. Patricia had said, of course, but had also noted, casually, that homeowners who chose not to cooperate with the process could be subject to an HOA-initiated eminent domain adjacent proceeding, and that the homeowner would typically be responsible for legal costs in such a process. Sandra was not sure what that meant exactly, but it sounded expensive and adversarial, and she did not have an HOA attorney on retainer. She signed. But that was not the part that stopped Gerald. The part that stopped Gerald was what Sandra said next. She had signed the document in the HOA office, in person, on a Thursday afternoon in late September. And when she handed the signed form back to Patricia at the front desk, Patricia had said she needed to take it to the back to get the notary stamp applied. Sandra had sat in the lobby and waited. Patricia came back 2 minutes later with the document fully notarized. Gerald asked, "You did not observe the notarization?" Sandra said, "No. Patricia took it to the back office. I assumed that was normal." Gerald thanked her and ended the call. He sat at the kitchen table. Under Ohio law, a notary public is required to witness the signature of the document's signatory in person at the time of notarization. The notary's stamp is not a rubber stamp of approval applied after the fact. It is a certification that the notary personally observed the signature being made and verified the signatory's identity at that moment. If Patricia Wallen had taken Sandra's already signed document into a back office and applied her notary stamp without Sandra present, that was an improper notarization. And if the same procedure had been applied to Gerald's easement, a document that Gerald had never signed at all, had never seen, had never appeared before anyone to execute, then Patricia Wallen had not made a procedural shortcut. She had notarized a fraudulent document. Gerald called Ferrara. Ferrara said, "We need the county recorder's office. Every recorded easement on this project is public record. I want to pull all of them, compare the notarization stamps, look at the dates, look at whether the same commission number appears on all of them." He went to the Franklin County Recorder's office that same afternoon. He requested all recorded instruments associated with the Sycamore Ridge HOA drainage corridor project filed in the prior 14 months. 11 documents came back. 11 easement agreements, all notarized by Patricia M. Wallen, Notary Public, State of Ohio, all bearing the same notary commission number. Ferrara called Gerald that evening. His voice was measured, but Gerald had spoken with him enough times by now to recognize when the measure was a lid on something else. He said, "I think we need to loop in more than civil counsel." Gerald said, "I know. The Franklin County Recorder's Office did not just have the easement documents. It had the full recorded history of the Sycamore Ridge Drainage Improvement Project, board meeting minutes submitted as part of the approval record, the executed contractor agreement, and 2 change order amendments that had been filed with the county as part of the project's public documentation trail." Ferrara spent 2 days with everything. He was the kind of attorney who read in order. Original documents first, amendments second, everything compared against everything else. It was slow work. It was the only kind that mattered. What he found was not a clerical error. It was a pattern. The drainage project had been put to competitive bid in June of the prior year. 3 companies submitted proposals. The low bid was $680,000 from a regional civil contractor with an established track record in Franklin County. The middle bid was $740,000 from another established firm. The high bid was $910,000. The board had approved the $740,000 bid at the annual homeowner meeting. That was what was disclosed to homeowners. That was what the assessment was based on. But the executed contract on file at the recorder's office was not with the $740,000 bidder. It was with Holbrook and Meridian Site Services, LLC, at a contract value of $1.1 million, signed by Diane Holbrook as board president. Ferrara cross-referenced the contractor against Ohio Secretary of State business registration records. Holbrook and Meridian Site Services, LLC, had been registered with the state in January of the prior year, 4 months before the project bid process opened. The registered agent was listed as Daniel R. Holbrook, with a business address in a suburb 15 miles east of Columbus. Ferrara ran the name. Daniel R. Holbrook was Diane Holbrook's husband. The HOA president of Sycamore Ridge had awarded a $1.1 million contract to a company owned by her husband. The company had not been one of the 3 firms that submitted competitive bids. It had been inserted into the process after the fact, through a change order mechanism, replacing the originally approved contractor with no homeowner notification and without a board vote that met the CC&R quorum requirement for expenditures over $50,000. The change order authorizing the switch had been approved at an August board meeting that lasted 11 minutes, attended by 3 of the 5 board members. 3 of 5. Under the Sycamore Ridge CC&RS, a valid quorum for expenditure approvals above $50,000 required 4 members. The vote had never been valid. Gerald listened to Ferrara read through this on the phone and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "She built the whole drainage project to move money to Daniel." Ferrara said, "That is what the documents suggest, because now the easements made sense in a way they hadn't before. The original $740,000 project had a defined footprint, a specific set of drainage corridors that stayed within existing HOA right-of-way and common areas. It did not require private property easements. It was designed to work within the space the HOA already controlled. The inflated $1.1 million version needed more scope to justify the additional cost. More scope meant more linear footage of drainage infrastructure. More linear footage meant going outside the existing right-of-way into the rear corridors of private properties along the ridge. Properties like Gerald's. The easements were not a procedural necessity. They were a fabrication to support a larger footprint that existed only to support a larger contract that existed only to benefit Daniel Holbrook's company. Every homeowner who had been pressured to sign an easement, every document that Patricia Wallen had notarized improperly or fraudulently, every mailing address that had been left outdated in the HOA system, all of it served one function. It moved $360,000 from 214 homeowners into an LLC registered 4 months before anyone knew there was a project to bid on. Ferrara recommended 3 parallel actions. First, retain a forensic document examiner to formally analyze Gerald's easement and produce a written report on the signature authenticity question. Second, file formal complaints with the Ohio Notary Section of the Secretary of State's office and with the Ohio Division of Real Estate, documenting the improper notarization procedures. Third, prepare a complaint package for the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office. He said the word he had been careful not to use before: fraud. Criminal fraud, potentially. And depending on how the contractor insertion was handled, possibly violations of Ohio's nonprofit corporation governance statutes as well. Gerald called Kevin and Marcus together on a 3-way call that night and laid it all out. Kevin drove back up that weekend. Marcus began building a detailed chronological timeline document. Every date, every action, every correspondence, in order, with sources cited. Gerald spent the following week reaching back out to neighbors with a new set of questions. Had anyone watched Patricia apply the notary stamp? Had anyone received a copy of their signed document? Were there any other discrepancies in the documents themselves? Wrong names, wrong addresses, wrong parcel identifiers? Harold and Gina Tremblay lived on the east end of the corridor. Harold was 71, a retired postal worker with the patient attention to paperwork that a career in mail routing develops in a person. He had kept his copy. Harold pulled it out and read it to Gerald over the phone. The parcel identification number in the document did not match the Franklin County parcel number for Harold and Gina's property. It matched a parcel 3 streets over, in an entirely different section of Sycamore Ridge. The notarized easement agreement that Holbrook and Meridian was using to justify drainage work on the Tremblays' property was legally attached to someone else's land. The Tremblays agreed, without hesitation, to join Gerald's complaint. By the end of the third week, Gerald had a coalition. Himself, the Tremblays, Sandra Voigt, Walt Pruitt, and two additional neighbors whose easement documents contained address errors consistent with the same outdated records problem that had caused Gerald's notification to go to the wrong address in the first place. 7 households, 7 sets of documented problems, and 1 forensic document examiner, retained through Ferrara and now in possession of Gerald's easement agreement, and a set of known signature exemplars going back 20 years, who would, 10 days later, deliver his written conclusion. The signature on Gerald Marsh's easement agreement was not produced by Gerald Marsh. Not a different initial, not a rushed version of his normal signature, a different hand. Someone else had written his name on that document. Gerald read the forensic report at the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening in November, with Carol's garden notebook open on the counter and the November dark pressing against the window. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel rage. He felt something quieter than either, the particular clarity that comes when a thing you already knew becomes something you can prove. He closed the report. He went to church on Sunday for the first time in months. He sat in the third pew from the back, where he and Carol had always sat, and he did not pray for victory. He prayed to do this right. He went home and began preparing for the community meeting. The Pinehurst Community Center was a beige-carpeted multi-purpose room on the east side of the Sycamore Ridge Common area. On normal months, HOA meetings there drew between 30 and 40 homeowners, most of them regulars with standing grievances about parking or landscaping, or the speed of the mail carriers through the neighborhood. On this night, 141 residents showed up. The folding chairs ran out before the room was half full. People stood along the back wall and lined the hallway outside the propped open door. A man named Don Heikkinen, who ran an IT consulting business from his garage on Maplecrest, had set up a laptop and projector to live stream the meeting to residents who couldn't get in. Gerald arrived at 6:40, 20 minutes early. Kevin sat to his left. Marcus sat to his right. Douglas Ferrara had taken a chair in the second-to-last row with a legal pad. The Tremblays were in the third row. Sandra Voigt had found a spot near the aisle on the left side. Walt Pruitt, retired English teacher, 3 houses east, the man who had signed under threat of legal fees, sat 2 chairs down from Sandra, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided something. Diane Holbrook arrived at 7:03 with HOA attorney Garfield Stroud and 2 board members, Teresa Pack, who taught middle school science and had been on the board for 2 years, and Rodrigo Castillo, who owned a landscaping business and had joined the board 14 months ago. The 5th board member, the one who had been at the August change order meeting with Diane, did not appear to be present. Diane scanned the room when she entered. Gerald watched her face. She registered the crowd, the full chairs, the standing rows, the live stream setup, in one sweep and showed nothing. She had been running these meetings for 18 months. She was practiced. She opened at 7:05 with the Pledge of Allegiance, the approval of prior minutes, and a brief budget update. The Landscaping Committee gave a 4-minute report. Diane moved through the early agenda items with the precise efficiency of a person who understands that procedural normalcy is its own form of control. When she reached new business, she did not wait for anyone else to raise the subject. "I know many of you are here this evening because of questions about the drainage improvement project," she said. "The board welcomes the opportunity to address those questions directly. We believe in transparency, and we believe that when homeowners have accurate information, concerns resolve themselves." Gerald raised his hand. Diane recognized him by name. He stood. He was 67 years old. He had spent his career in rooms like this one, not community meetings, but the particular kind of bureaucratic room where people with authority expected you to be intimidated by their authority, and where the most effective thing you could do was decline to be. He did not rush. He said his name, his address, the number of years he had lived in Sycamore Ridge. He said that 3 weeks ago, a contractor arrived on his property and began excavating a drainage trench without his knowledge or consent. He said the contractor produced an easement agreement bearing his name, and that he had never seen that document before in his life and had never signed it. He said he had retained a forensic document examiner to analyze the signature. He said the examiner's conclusion, in a signed written report, was that the signature on the easement was not consistent with his known handwriting, not a variation of his signature, not a rushed version, but a signature produced by a different person. He said that the notarization on his document, and on at least one other homeowner's document in this room, had been performed in a manner inconsistent with Ohio notary law. Specifically, that the signatory was not present when the notary stamp was applied. He paused. He said, "The contractor performing this work is Holbrook and Meridian Site Services, LLC. That company was registered with the Ohio Secretary of State in January of last year. It is owned by Daniel R. Holbrook. The ventilation system ran." Somewhere in the back, a chair shifted. He said, "I am asking the board tonight to immediately suspend the drainage improvement project, pending an independent legal and financial audit. And I am asking the board to explain to the 214 homeowners of this community how a project approved at $740,000 became a $1.1 million contract awarded, without competitive bidding and without homeowner notification, to the HOA president's husband's company." The room broke. Not into shouting, into the particular noise of a crowd when everyone begins talking to the person next to them at the same moment. A wave of voices that rose and leveled and didn't quite stop. Diane called for order. She got partial order. She turned to Gerald with the expression she had arrived prepared to use, measured, concerned, not defensive. She said the board took the integrity of HOA processes very seriously. She said the change order had been approved in accordance with the board's fiduciary authority. She said Douglas Ferrara was welcome to submit any concerns in writing, and the board would review them. Gerald said, "Was it disclosed to homeowners that the contractor performing this work is owned by your husband?" Diane said conflict of interest protocols had been followed. Gerald said, "Was it disclosed to homeowners?" Garfield Stroud spoke before Diane could answer. He said that this line of questioning was not appropriate for an open meeting, that legal concerns should be pursued through proper legal channels, and that the board was not in a position to respond to allegations made without due process. Walt Pruitt stood up. He did not ask permission or wait to be recognized. He said, "I signed my easement after Patricia Wallen told me that if I refused, the HOA could take me to court and I would be required to pay all associated legal costs. Is that the board's official position on how easements are obtained in this community?" The room was very quiet. Teresa Pack spoke. She said she wanted to note, for the record, that she had not been present at the August board meeting where the change order was approved. Diane said Teresa's attendance record was not the issue at hand. Teresa said, "It is if there was a quorum problem with that vote. Under our CC&Rs, expenditures over $50,000 require 4 board members present. If only 3 were there, the vote wasn't valid." Rodrigo Castillo cleared his throat. He said he would like to see the original bid documentation for the project, the competitive bid submissions that had been presented to homeowners at the annual meeting. He said he wanted to understand how the original approved contractor had been replaced. Diane looked at her board. For the first time that evening, her expression was not practiced. It was calculating. She was doing math she did not like the answer to. Garfield Stroud moved to table the open discussion pending a formal board review. Diane seconded. The meeting did not come to any vote on Gerald's suspension request. It ended at 9:18. As the room emptied, Gerald stood near the door talking to Marcus and Kevin. He was aware of the conversations happening around him, neighbors who had never spoken to each other, comparing notes, exchanging phone numbers. The community Facebook group would be unusable by morning. He felt a hand on his elbow. Teresa Pack. She handed him a business card. She said, quietly, "I'd like to speak with your attorney. This week, if possible." Gerald looked at the card. He looked at the empty room behind her, the folding chairs, the community bulletin board, the watercolor painting of the original Sycamore Ridge gatehouse that had hung on that wall since 1998. 22 years. He had never had a board member hand him a business card in this hallway. He put the card in his shirt pocket. Something was changing. The complaint arrived at the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December, delivered by Douglas Ferrara in person. It was accompanied by a 37-page evidentiary package. The package was organized the way Gerald Marsh organized everything, in order, numbered, with a table of contents and a one-page summary at the front that stated the core facts without embellishment. Ferrara had learned, in 3 weeks of working with Gerald, that his client had a gift for precision that made legal documentation feel less like advocacy and more like engineering. The package contained the forensic document examiner's signed report concluding that the signature on Gerald's easement was produced by a person other than Gerald Allen Marsh, sworn declarations from Sandra Voigt describing the notarization procedure at the HOA office and her non-presence during the actual stamp application, a comparison chart of 11 easement notarizations, all bearing Patricia M. Wallen's commission stamp, noting that 6 had been notarized on the same calendar date, despite the signatories having no reported contact with Patricia on that date. The parcel identification error in the Tremblay's document. The Ohio Secretary of State business registration for Holbrook and Meridian Site Services, LLC. The original competitive bid summary presented to homeowners at the annual meeting. The county recorded contract with Holbrook and Meridian at $1.1 million. The change order minutes showing a 3-member vote on an expenditure requiring a 4-member quorum, and the Sycamore Ridge CC&R language specifying that quorum requirement, highlighted. Ferrara also included a signed declaration from Teresa Pack. Teresa's declaration stated that at the August board meeting where the change order was approved, Diane Holbrook had presented the contractor substitution as a cost-saving measure resulting from a renegotiated scope of work. Diane had not disclosed her personal relationship to Daniel Holbrook or his ownership of Holbrook and Meridian. Teresa had voted yes. She stated clearly, had she known the contractor was owned by the board president's husband, she would have required a formal conflict of interest disclosure process before any vote, and would not have voted to approve the substitution without one. Rodrigo Castillo provided a nearly identical declaration. 2 weeks after the complaint was filed, the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office opened a formal inquiry into the notarization practices associated with the Sycamore Ridge easement documents. The week after that, Patricia Wallen submitted her resignation as HOA Administrative Coordinator. She did not issue a statement. She stopped answering her personal phone. The week after that, Holbrook and Meridian Site Services received a county stop work order, citing active legal proceedings and unresolved property encroachment claims at 44 Sycamore Ridge Drive. The excavator left Gerald's backyard on a Thursday morning. He watched from the kitchen window, coffee in hand, the way this had all started. The machine was loaded onto a flatbed by a crew that worked in the particular quiet of people who know something has gone wrong, but whose job does not include explaining it. One of the younger workers, Gerald had seen him out there every morning for 3 weeks, looked up at the kitchen window as the truck pulled out. He gave a small nod. Gerald raised his mug. The formal homeowner hearing was scheduled for the second Tuesday of January. Under Ohio's Planned Community Act, any homeowner or group of homeowners alleging procedural violations by an HOA board could demand a formal hearing before the full board. Gerald had filed that demand, signed by 6 co-complainants, the week after the community meeting. The board was required to hold the hearing within 60 days. Garfield Stroud attempted to delay it. Ferrara held the timeline. The hearing was held as scheduled. Sycamore Ridge had 214 households. On that Tuesday night in January, 178 of them were represented, in person or watching Don Heikkinen's live stream, which this time had a proper camera setup and had been announced in advance on the community website. Garfield Stroud sat at the board table. So did Diane Holbrook. She had not resigned yet. And Teresa Pack and Rodrigo Castillo. The 5th board member, the one who had been absent from the community meeting, called in by phone and was mostly silent. In the 3rd row, the HOA's liability insurance carrier was represented by a claims analyst named Mitchell Carr, who had a notepad, a recording device placed openly on the chair beside him, and the expression of a man attending an event whose outcome he already needed to prepare documents for. Gerald went first. He had not prepared remarks in the way that people usually mean. He had not written a speech. He had prepared the facts. He stood at the front of that room and delivered them in the order they had happened, citing each document as he referenced it, acknowledging what was proven and what was alleged, and being careful not to confuse the two. He covered the excavator, the easement, the signature initial discrepancy he had noticed on day 1, the forensic confirmation, the address error that caused his notification to go astray, The survey discrepancy that showed the work was 16 feet inside his line rather than 12, the certified letter and Diane's response threatening him with sole legal liability, the retaliatory citations, Sandra's account of the notarization procedure, the 11 recorded easements and their single notary, the county recorder documents revealing Holbrook and Meridian, the business registration, the change order, the quorum violation. He was factual. He was unhurried. He did not use the word fraud. He did not have to. Sandra Voigt read her statement. Her voice held steady through most of it, and shook slightly on the sentence where she described sitting alone in the HOA lobby while Patricia took her document to the back office, trusting that the process was what she had been told it was. Harold Tremblay held up a printed copy of his easement agreement and read out the parcel identification number. Then he read out the parcel number from his Franklin County property records. The room could hear that they were different. "I don't know whose property this easement is attached to," Harold said, "but it is not mine, and Holbrook and Meridian used it as authorization to install drainage infrastructure on my land." Walt Pruitt read from notes. He read the exact language Patricia Wallen had used on the phone when he had called to ask questions, language that implied a court proceeding and personal legal liability if he did not cooperate. He read the date and time of the call. He had made the notes immediately after hanging up, he said, because something about the conversation had made him want a record of it. Teresa Pack stood as a sitting board member and addressed the room. She said she had voted yes on the August change order without knowledge of the conflict of interest. She said the board she sat on had not properly approved the contract that Holbrook and Meridian was operating under. She said she was moving to request that the full board consider a formal vote to suspend the project and initiate an independent audit. Then Douglas Ferrara spoke. Ferrara was not a theatrical man. He did not raise his voice or use rhetorical flourishes. He moved through the evidentiary package section by section, explaining each element, citing the relevant Ohio statutes, and allowing the facts to build in the room the way a properly engineered structure builds, load by load, each piece supporting the next. He explained Ohio Notary Code Section 147.53 and what personal presence of the signatory means and why it exists. He explained the Sycamore Ridge CC&R quorum provision and what a vote of 3 on a 5-member board means for an expenditure of this size. He explained Ohio Revised Code Chapter 4728 governing conflicts of interest for nonprofit corporation officers, and what the disclosure obligation is, and what the consequence of non-disclosure is. He did not conclude with a speech. He said, "The homeowners of Sycamore Ridge are owed a truthful accounting of what happened to their money and their property rights. The documents support that accounting. The board has the authority and the obligation to begin that process tonight." Diane Holbrook was offered the floor to respond. Garfield Stroud leaned over and spoke in her ear. She declined. Teresa Pack moved to suspend the drainage improvement project immediately, pending an independent financial and legal audit to be conducted by a firm with no prior relationship to the HOA or its board members. Rodrigo Castillo seconded. The remaining board member, on the phone, abstained. Diane Holbrook did not vote. The motion passed. The room did not applaud. There was a sound, not quite silence and not quite noise, that moved through 178 people like a held breath released. Gerald stood at the front of the room and looked out at his neighbors. Walt Pruitt, hands folded in his lap. Sandra Voigt with her eyes closed for a moment. The Tremblays holding each other's hands. Kevin and Marcus in the third row watching him. Mitchell Carr, the insurance claims analyst, was already writing. 11 days later, Diane Holbrook submitted her written resignation as HOA president. She cited personal reasons. She did not attend the emergency homeowner session at which the community elected an interim board president. In March, the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office filed 2 criminal counts against Patricia Wallen for improper notarization of a public document based on the Marsh and Voigt easements. The broader financial investigation, the change order, the contractor relationship, the conflict of interest, was referred to the Ohio Attorney General's office, which opened a separate civil investigation into potential violations of the Ohio Nonprofit Corporation Act and HOA governance law. Daniel Holbrook's company submitted an invoice for partial project completion to the HOA's insurance carrier. The carrier disputed the amount. The dispute entered litigation. Gerald's case. the forged signature, the fraudulent notarization, the illegal encroachment, was the first thing the interim board addressed. Working with Ferrara, they executed a formal rescission of the recorded easement at the county recorder's office. A licensed surveyor was retained to stake the correct property boundary. On a Saturday morning in late March, Gerald stood in his backyard and watched the surveyor drive a steel pin into the ground at the northeast corner of his property, exactly where the survey had always said it was, exactly where it had always been. Gerald had a cup of coffee. The rose bushes along the fence were bare still, another few weeks before the buds would show. He could wait. Spring came late to Sycamore Ridge that year, the way it always did on the north-facing slope of the ridge, where the cold sat in the low spots through the end of March, and the last of the frost didn't let go until the first week of April. But by mid-April, the dogwoods along the front entrance were in bloom, white and soft-edged in the early light, and the decorative stonework that Holbrook and Meridian had completed along the south corridor before the stop work order, the portion of the project that had been properly within HOA common area and legitimately authorized, caught the morning sun in a way that was, despite everything, genuinely attractive. Good stonework. Whatever else Daniel Holbrook's company had done, they could lay stone. Gerald noticed that. He hadn't expected to, but he did. He noticed things more carefully now. He was not sure whether the past months had changed him or simply clarified him. The independent financial audit came back in late April. The auditors were a Columbus firm with no prior relationship to Sycamore Ridge, retained by the new interim board. Their report ran 42 pages. It was the kind of document Gerald would have found deeply satisfying under different circumstances, precise, evidenced, organized with care. The findings were not surprising. They were damaging. The original $740,000 project scope was, in the auditor's assessment, a reasonable and competitive estimate for the described work. The $360,000 change order represented costs that could not be reconciled with any documented change in project scope. The additional funds had gone to Holbrook and Meridian in 3 tranches: a mobilization surcharge of $95,000, an equipment staging fee of $87,000, and a project management coordination assessment of $178,000. The auditor's language, in the measured register of people whose job requires understatement, described these charges as inconsistent with industry norms for a project of this type and scale, and noted that no competitive verification of these costs had been performed. In less careful language, $360,000 had been taken from 214 homeowners and placed in a company owned by the HOA president's husband through a process that bypassed competitive bidding, disclosed no conflict of interest, and rested on a board vote that had never been valid. The audit also noted, in a separate section, that the portion of the project requiring private property easements, the rear corridor work that required easements across Gerald's property and his neighbors, had not been included in the original engineering specifications. It had been added as part of the scope expansion that justified the change order. The original $740,000 design had stayed within existing HOA right-of-way throughout. Gerald read that section twice. There was never a legitimate engineering reason to cross his property line. The trench in his backyard, the forged easement with his name on it, the retaliatory citations against Carol's roses, none of it had been necessary for a drainage project. It had been necessary for a $1.1 million contract. He and his garden had been a line item. He thought about that for a while. Then he went outside and checked on the tomatoes. The HOA's insurance carrier reached a settlement with Holbrook and Meridian in June, a reduced payment for completed work, with a subrogation claim reserved against the principals. The details of the settlement were not public. Gerald did not spend much time on them. Patricia Wallen entered a plea agreement in May. She pleaded no contest to 2 counts of improper notarization of a public document. She was fined $4,000, her Ohio notary commission was permanently revoked, and she was sentenced to 18 months of probation with 200 hours of community service. Her attorney argued in sentencing that she had acted under instruction from the board president and had not understood the criminal implications. The court acknowledged this as a mitigating factor in sentencing and did not find it excuse the statutory violations. The Ohio Attorney General's civil investigation into the board's conduct remained open. It would take another year to reach its conclusions. Gerald tracked the docket number on the AG's website and checked it occasionally the way some men check the weather, not anxiously, just as a matter of staying informed. The charges specific to the forged signature on Gerald's easement, the document that the forensic examiner had confirmed bore a signature not his own, remained under active investigation by the county prosecutor. No charges had been filed by the time the roses bloomed. Gerald would not discuss that part of the case in detail. Ferrara had advised discretion, and Gerald was a man who took good advice. What Gerald did, in the spring and early summer, was rebuild the rear garden beds. The excavator had not reached the cedar planters. It had been stopped just short, but the staging area had compacted a 20-foot run of soil along the rear fence line into something that would not grow anything without intervention. Gerald rented a tiller from the hardware store on Route 16. He ran it himself on a Saturday morning in early May, slowly, with his back offering its opinion at regular intervals, and the kitchen radio audible through the open window. Kevin came up Memorial Day weekend. They pulled out the old lumber from 2 of the beds, it had aged past useful, and put in new cedar, pre-treated. Gerald had measured everything out the week before. The joints came together clean. Marcus drove down from Cleveland the following Saturday and brought his kids, Aiden, 11, and Priya, 9, who arrived with the particular energy of children who have been in a car for 2 hours and are now outdoors and needed. They were given jobs, filling the new beds with amended soil from a pile Gerald had ordered in, planting the tomatoes and peppers and herbs according to a diagram Gerald had drawn based on Carol's notebook layout, and, Priya's contribution, insisting on a watermelon seedling that Gerald purchased at the nursery, with the full understanding that it would not survive the Ohio summer. At some point during the planting, Priya found Carol's green notebook on the kitchen counter and brought it outside. "Grandpa, what is this?" Gerald sat down on the garden bench, the same bench Carol had picked out, a teak thing from a garden center that had long since weathered to silver, and opened the notebook. He showed them the sketches. The pencil drawings of the bed layout, the handwritten notes in the margins. "Plant here in April. This one needs afternoon shade. Put it against the east fence. Gerald will say the spacing is wrong, and he will be right, and I will do it this way anyway because it looks better." Aiden asked, "Is that Grandma's handwriting?" Gerald said yes. Priya asked, "Can we plant the roses?" Gerald looked at the rear fence line. The rootstock he had ordered from a specialty nursery in western Ohio had arrived in mid-April. Not Carol's exact variety, which was discontinued, but a climbing bourbon rose that bloomed in a similar shade of deep pink. He had healed them in temporarily in pots along the garage wall. He said, "That's exactly what we're going to do." They planted the roses that afternoon. Gerald dug the holes. Aiden held the root balls in place while Gerald backfilled. Priya watered each one with a level of thoroughness that left the bed looking like a small pond. It was the best Saturday Gerald had spent in several years. The community, in the months after the hearing, changed in ways that were not dramatic but were real. The Sycamore Ridge Facebook group, which had been, for a few weeks, a place of unusual tension, quieted. Not into silence, but into something more like neighborhood conversation. People posting about garage sales, lost cats, the particular variety of bird that had shown up in someone's feeder. The new board, elected at an emergency homeowners meeting in February, posted full meeting agendas 48 hours before each session. Financial summaries went out to all homeowners quarterly. Public comment was scheduled at the top of every meeting, not at the end after people had already gone home. Walt Pruitt had run for the board and won. He took minutes with the precision of a man who had spent 35 years grading student writing and knew that clarity was the only form of honesty that couldn't be walked back. The minutes went up on the community website within 5 days of every meeting. Sandra Voigt started a neighborhood email list. Within 6 weeks, it had 130 subscribers. Harold and Gina Tremblay planted a vegetable garden in their backyard for the first time in their marriage. They told Gerald it was his fault. He told them Carol would have liked them. The drainage project, the legitimate $740,000 version, redesigned to stay within existing HOA right-of-way, was rebid in the fall and awarded to the original low bidder, the regional civil contractor who had submitted $680,000 the first time and had been set aside without explanation. The work was completed the following spring. The drainage along the community's low-lying north perimeter improved measurably. The water table dropped. The standing puddles after rain, which had been a source of neighborhood complaints for a decade, were gone. None of the final project footprint touched Gerald's property. None of it needed to. By August, the watermelon had failed, as predicted. One morning it was there, small and obstinate, and the next morning something, frost or determination, or the logic of Ohio summers, had ended its ambitions. Priya was disappointed over the phone. Gerald told her it had given everything it had. The tomatoes were extraordinary. 4 varieties, 32 plants, more than Gerald could eat alone, and so he brought bags to the neighbors and left some on the Tremblays' porch, and dropped a box at the church on Sunday mornings through September. The roses bloomed for the first time in late July. Not full, first-year plantings never were, but there, pink and open along the rear fence line in the morning light, the same light Carol had called the October light, except that it came earlier now, came in July because he was looking for it. Gerald photographed them. He sent the photo to Kevin and Marcus in a group text. He did not add a caption. They called him within 5 minutes of each other. A few months after everything had settled, Kevin asked his father what the hardest moment had been. Not the most legally complicated, not the most stressful, the hardest. Gerald thought about it for longer than Kevin expected. He said it wasn't the excavator. It wasn't seeing his own forged signature on a document he had never touched. It wasn't Diane Holbrook's email telling him he would bear the costs of any legal action alone. It was the moment on the phone with Ferrara, early in the first week, when he was still deciding. When the voice inside him said, "You are 67 years old. You are tired. You live alone. You do not need this fight. Let them have the 12 feet. Let them have the garden. It's just property." Because that voice sounded reasonable. It sounded like self-preservation. And the only thing wrong with it was that it was asking Gerald to disappear. The garden was not just property. It was the last project he and Carol had done together. It was the notebook on the kitchen counter with her handwriting in the margins. It was the place where, on a Saturday in May, his grandchildren had crouched in the dirt and planted roses because he asked them to, and because that felt important to all of them, in a way that none of them would have been able to explain. And it was not only his. Once Gerald started asking questions, he found Walt Pruitt, a retired teacher who had been told that asking questions could cost him everything. He found Sandra Voigt, who had trusted a process and sat alone in a lobby while someone in a back office did something she hadn't been asked to watch. He found Harold and Gina Tremblay, whose property rights had been attached to the wrong parcel number by someone who apparently expected no one to check. He found 214 homeowners who had paid a special assessment for a project they had been told cost $740,000, not knowing that $360,000 of it had left the community through a company registered 6 months before there was a project to bid on. The HOA system, when it functions the way it is designed to function, is not an adversary. It is a mechanism for maintaining shared standards, pooling resources for community improvements, and preserving the value of the place where people have built their lives. Most HOA boards are made up of volunteers, neighbors with jobs and families who give their time because someone has to. Most of them do their best. But the system only works when the people running it remain accountable to the people funding it. When that accountability disappears, when board meetings become closed rooms, when financial changes move without homeowner notice, when the answer to a question is a threat, the mechanism inverts. It becomes a way for whoever holds the gavel to extract from everyone who trusts the process. Gerald didn't expose a scheme. He stopped an excavator and started asking questions out loud in rooms where people expected him to be quiet about it. The scheme exposed itself. It exposed itself because Gerald was the kind of man who kept copies of everything. Because he knew what his own signature looked like. Because he had a son who drove 4 hours on a Saturday morning without being asked twice, and another son who built timelines the way other people breathe, and an attorney who knew that precision was the only argument that didn't leave room to argue back. What Gerald would tell you, if you asked him, is that he did not win because he was exceptional. He won because he did not stop, because he put things in writing, because he asked questions in public where the answers had to be given on record, because when the institution told him the weight of the institution was sufficient reason to comply, he understood that weight and a fact are not the same thing. If you are watching this and you have received an HOA notice that doesn't add up, a fine that appeared without a prior warning, an assessment for a project you don't recognize, a demand for access to your property with documentation you've never seen, here is what Gerald Marsh would tell you to do. Pull out your governing documents, your CC and Rs, your HOA bylaws, your original deed. Read them. They are public, and they are binding on the HOA as much as on you. Put everything in writing. Every conversation you have with the HOA after you have a concern should be followed by a written summary sent by email or certified mail. Every document they send you should be acknowledged in writing. A verbal agreement in an HOA dispute is worth exactly what it's written on. Request the records. Board meeting minutes, financial summaries, contractor agreements, bid documentation. These are generally available to homeowners under state law and under most governing documents. Ask for them in writing. Get your survey. Know exactly where your property line is, not where the fence is, where the line is. And find your neighbors. Gerald found Walt Pruitt and Sandra Voigt and Harold and Gina Tremblay because he picked up the phone and asked simple questions. Every one of them had a piece of the picture. None of them had all of it alone. Gerald Marsh, retired civil engineer, 22-year resident of Sycamore Ridge Drive, stopped $1 million project built on forged signatures and fraudulent notarizations and an unauthorized contract awarded to the right man's company. He stopped it with patience, with documentation, with the particular stubbornness of a man who knows what his name looks like and refuses to accept a version of it that isn't his. He did not get back everything that was taken. The months of stress, the legal fees, the weeks of uncertainty, those don't have a refund. But he got the survey pin in the corner of his property, in the right place. He got the roses back along the fence. He got his grandchildren in the dirt on a Saturday in May, learning, for reasons they can't fully articulate yet, why a piece of ground is worth fighting for. If this story is one you recognize, if you have been in a dispute with an HOA, a contractor, a community board, or a neighbor who counted on your silence, leave your story in the comments. These cases matter. The details matter. Other homeowners learn from what you went through. Subscribe if you want to keep following these stories. We will keep telling them. Gerald Marsh is in his garden. The roses are coming in.